First off, thank you to Professor Jessetoriak. Thank you to the Donahue Institute for Ethics, Diversity, and Inclusion. And thanks to all of you for coming out today and listening to what I have to say. I'm going to try to keep these remarks somewhat brief. I'd really like to have a conversational component here. I'm happy to answer questions. As a journalist, I think one of the reasons I've made a career of this is I'm really good at getting very focused on the subject for 6 weeks, learning everything I can about it, and then moving on. And that's kind of how I approach every story, including this one. So there was a probably 2-month span where my wife got really sick of hearing me talk about conservative and liberal professors, and then I wrote the story. It came out, and I try not to think about it. I've written many other stories since this one, so I'm happy to kind of revisit this subject. And it's it's kind of crazy. It's a little bit gloomy day out, but it's really nice to be on a college campus. And I think it was a year ago I was busy reporting this story. I was running around the Boston University campus. I was going out to Western Mass. But I want to start off this conversation by admitting that when Jesse reached out to me, I was first I was really honored and super excited. And then I got really nervous, and I said, I don't know who Jesse is, and I don't know what the Donahue Institute is. Is he some far-right nationalist who's, bringing me in to, fire up the crowds and, kind of beat the drum here? Or, is he some far-left progressive professor that wants to, bring me in for a public flogging and just destroy all the points I make in this article? And I'm being facetious, but I was legitimately paranoid, and Jesse, I think, we had a conversation where we hashed this out. But, I'm not usually a paranoid person, but with this story, it was my experience that everyone who read it found what they wanted to find in it. If you were a conservative, I got a lot of emails from conservatives who, were congratulating me, telling me, way to stick it to the liberals. A lot of them would also say that they were praying for me, which I don't fully understand. But it was just kind of the world of email. I also, got a lot of emails from the left telling me what a pile of garbage this article was, how poorly researched it was, how, if you looked at my sources, they were all saying the same thing. I also, and I'm, bring up this piece of, an excerpt from a piece of fan mail I got to really illustrate how wild some of the responses were. I came across a recent story on the percentage of liberals in New England colleges and the ruination of higher education. This is all very true. I am hopeful that in the next few months the term liberal for these very intimidating and actually criminal teachers can be better designated as spies of the American Communist Party, USSR, and their dope-dealing saboteurs, serial rapists, and assorted faculty killers. This is probably from someone who spends too much time on the internet. It went on for about 2,000 more words. I did not respond to this email. But as I said, it really did seem like everyone found what they wanted to find in this story. Whereas, I set out to report on, facts, and I wanted to do a piece of expository writing and, interview sources and do journalism and present a story. But, as we'll get into, it was the case that, everyone had their own take on this and saw what they wanted to see. The other thing that I noticed with the responses to this story, it didn't matter if you were sending me an email telling me how great it was or how bad it was, everyone assumed that I was a conservative. For the record, I'm not a conservative. If I'm being totally honest, I'm pretty apathetic when it comes to politics. I hate to say it, but until last year, I've never voted. So 2016 was the first time I've ever voted. I don't know if I'll do it again. I view myself, I'm not a political junkie. I try not to get worked up about politics too much. And I think that is what allowed me to kind of come at this story, as a blank slate. But I wanted to open up by talking about the reaction that this piece elicited and share that kind of crazy email and, really think about the reaction, because that's where I do have some expertise. I'm not a student. I was an undergrad at UMass in 2001 when Bush was in office, and it seemed like everyone on the UMass Amherst campus, it was just everyone agreed that Bush was the worst, and there was no debate over, the policies in Iraq. It was just everything was anti-Bush. And again, not being the, I was a political science major, but I wasn't a political junkie, and I kind of just rolled with the punches and did my thing, and never got too worked up about it. My level of expertise here is coming as a reporter, and I want to hear from students, and I would love to hear from professors here, because I'm also not a professor. I do teach. I've taught at Regis College, I've taught at Tufts College, and I've never, until writing this piece, thought about my own viewpoint, my own bias entering the classroom. Then I went back and looked at the syllabi I made for some of these classes and was like, wow, this doesn't have a huge spectrum of viewpoint diversity. I kind of started thinking about the issue there, but let's talk about the reaction that this piece elicited. Let's look at this cover. That is an aggressive cover. I thought my boss was crazy for thinking this was a good idea. Putting how liberals are ruining college on the cover of Boston magazine, one of the most progressive enclaves in the country. Seeing this on Whole Foods next to Yoga magazine and, Pets Monthly, it seemed outrageously aggressive. And I still do cringe a little bit at the headline, How Liberals Are Ruining College. It's such strong language. So this is something that I often remind people. This is the cover of the magazine. A cover of a magazine is, the intent of it is to sell, to get people to pick it up. So I always like to say, well, the real headline of the story, the real title of this story was One Size Fits All. So, when you bought the magazine to see how liberals ruined college, and you actually got to the page, the story itself was called One Size Fits All. And I strongly advocated that, this should be the headline on the internet when we put this story online, and that is a debate that I lost. So, online, the story carries the headline, How Liberals Are Ruining College. But I still, I come back to this, because this doesn't provide context necessarily, but it is not as strong of a take as, saying how liberals ruin college. And thinking about the reaction that this piece elicited, I think a lot of people read that headline and made up their minds about what the story was about. This is a story written by a conservative person who, is really going to take it to those liberals. Look, the headline says how liberals are ruining college. It's a several thousand word article. It must be, a hit piece on liberals. I still think about this all the time. It was such an aggressive headline. So how did we get to the point? How did, I end up in editorial meetings where, we were talking about whether this was a good idea for a cover. And it comes, this kind of origin story of this article, as most great ideas happened, the idea for this was kind of over beers with my boss. We were unwinding on a Friday after closing out an issue in the summer of 2016. And my boss said, we were talking about what we had been reading, and my boss said, hey, I read this op-ed in the New York Times, and it said something crazy. It said something like, there's, 50 liberals to every one conservative. And I kind of rolled my eyes on my boss, and I was like, that can't be right. And then we kind of, sat there and we chatted a little bit, and he was kind of dropping the breadcrumbs to get me interested in this story idea. And he was, didn't you go to UMass Amherst? What was that like? And I had never really thought about, the politics of my professors. But then I started, I went home that weekend, and I started kind of mulling it over, and I said, maybe this is a good story idea. Maybe my boss does know something. And he either emailed me or I went online, and I found the New York Times op-ed. Because, as my boss was telling me about this, Obviously it was 28 to 1, that was the ratio. So for every, there was this op-ed and it was 28 to 1. So then, all right, maybe the numbers are true, but surely the person who was writing this op-ed, I kind of convinced myself, had to be a quack or, had to have a very strong, bend or manipulate the data to serve the conservative argument. So I was convinced that, even if there is something that shows that there's this 28 to 1 figure, it's got to be totally, biased research out of a conservative think tank. It wasn't. It was by a professor who identifies as a centrist. His name's Sam Abrams. He's at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, a very, respected liberal arts college. He went to, Harvard for his doctorate. And Sam and I talked for a while on the phone. And I kept trying to feel him out to find, and I was, to be totally honest, I was probably looking for a reason not to write this story. I was looking for a reason to be like, oh, we can't trust this guy's numbers. It's totally, this guy's a real crackpot. He wasn't at all. He was a professor to, whatever, the most professional you can imagine. His research was buttoned up. He'd been working on this issue for, thinking about it for years. And he really, carefully walked me through his research, explained how he got the data, talked about how there was 25 years worth of these surveys among professors. So I kind of left that conversation without any excuse to not write this article. So again, the conversation went on, and I started reporting it. So then I realized that I had agreed to write a long-form magazine article on a ratio. I have written about murders, I've written about the opioid epidemic, I've written about competitive bagpipers. These are stories that have, strong, interesting characters. They have natural drama, they have tension, they have a beginning, middle, and end, and a very clear narrative arc. Now I had somehow had to figure out how am I going to write a story on a ratio that's 28 to 1. I don't fancy myself a think piece writer. I fancy myself a reporter. There are plenty of people out there who can sit down and, write think pieces on, any subject that comes to mind and just crank out, kind of, maybe more opinion than reporting, but that's not what I do. So, I put my reporter cap on and, all right, so there's this ratio. There seems to be a lot more progressive professors than conservative professors in New England. That's really not that big of a surprise. How am I going to report this? How am I going to actually make a story out of this? So I did what reporters do, and I just started calling and emailing everyone. I was reaching out to, I was just blanketing, not like, not mass emails, but I was just going through political science departments, sociology departments. I was really interested in social sciences. So I was going through all the nearby schools, emailing professors. I had talked with Sam Abrams, the guy who did the research, to see if, there has to be other conservative professors, can you give me some names and I'll reach out to them and try to talk to them. And, I'm a pretty optimistic guy, and I was like, who wouldn't want to talk to me about this? This is, it's Boston Magazine, it's a story about academics. Like, people be champing at the bit to chat with me. So I, got a handful of conservative professors, and it turned out none of them wanted to talk to me at first. So here are 2 quotes I got from professors declining to talk. I'd rather not, but thanks for asking. I'm weary of the subject. Plus, I have to live in this environment. And then I really like this one. Your article sounds really interesting. 28 to 1 is a lot. But I think I said all I have to say in the piece you refer to. Many thanks for being in touch. There was one exception. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Harvey Mansfield. He is a professor at Harvard. He has been there in one form or another since, I believe, 1949. He started as an undergraduate. He's a longtime professor. I won't read this long exchange I had with Harvey, but I'll just kind of leave it up there for you guys to digest for a second. I think it's pretty telling. Harvey is not a man to mince words, as you can tell. But at the same time, I started worrying because I had this really wonderful conversation with Professor Mansfield, and he wasn't the person that was going to make this story work. He certainly had an interesting perspective here and very valuable insight, and he was certainly a fearless commentator. But his comments were kind of divisive. Always means more liberals of different colors are wearing skirts. I wanted to elevate this story and have a more nuanced take. So I started reaching out to professors. I found a few, but when you're dealing with something where there's allegedly 28 liberal professors and one conservative professor, and you're looking for that one conservative professor, it's really hard. So you're dealing with what is apparently a scarce population, so it became difficult to find that conservative professor who would talk with me. So then I started reaching out to college administrators, and then by the way, there were plenty of professors who were happy to chat with me, but who were self-identified as progressives or liberals, and that was great. And I talked to everyone that would talk to me. And then I talked to Isabella Roche, Provost and Dean of Bennington College, and we had this really wonderful conversation. That number 28-1 does give one pause in thinking about what ideological diversity is and what an institution's responsibilities are, and thinking about it, she said. It's a really important educational question. So I really loved this quote, and I really cherished talking with Dean Roche. It was such a enlightening conversation. But I was writing for a general audience. I didn't want to tackle this as an important educational question per se. I was writing this for a general audience magazine. An important educational question, that's great if I was writing this piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education. But I wasn't. I was writing this for a magazine that is sold to moms that live in Newton and Wellesley, and that's sold at Whole Foods in the city, and people pick up, to find out the best new restaurants. So this had to be a general interest magazine. I didn't want to frame it as a purely, educational question that I was exploring, and I didn't want to get bogged down in talking about the methodology behind Sam Abrams' 28-1, the research that led him to that 28-1 number, because that's something I found when I was talking to professors. Almost all the conversations went to, well, what's his methodology? Because it must be flawed. And, flawed or not, I felt kind of good that the Times had published his op-ed, because it was like, when I was reaching out to people, it wasn't like I was sending them a Fox News op-ed, I was sending them a New York Times op-ed. And I think that surprised a lot of people. And it wasn't an academic journal, but it gave a sense of legitimacy, that this wasn't just, coming out of the conservative media. So I got the privilege of essentially going back to school. I thought, all right, well, I have these, I have interesting quotes from administrators. I have great quotes from professors. But, is the mom in Wellesley who's buying Boston Magazine and wants to read this article, is she going to care that much about this? Why does this issue matter? Why does it actually matter that there are 28 liberal professors for every one conservative professor? And I was talking over this with my editor, and we were trying to figure it out. And then, it kind of dawned on me, I should probably just go to college campuses and start interviewing students. And somebody, said, oh, what you should do is go find the young Republican clubs and see how they're doing on campus these days, especially, in New England. And that's what I did. And I didn't, I didn't set out to go to Brandeis specifically. I just started reaching out to different Facebook groups and emailing different conservative student groups that I could find. And it just so happened that Brandeis, the semester was fully in swing. The conservative group, the student group was just, kind of getting their act together and having their first meetings of the semester. And, I talked with one of the young guys out there and he said, hey, come out, you can sit in on our conversation. So So, I remember going out, it was in October last year, going out to the Brandeis campus, going to the Young Conservative meeting. And mind you, this was at a time when, I don't think any polls showed Donald Trump winning in October of 2016. This was at a time when it seemed that, everyone, every news channel, every, media outlet was kind of calling the race for Hillary. It seemed like President Trump was putting his foot in his mouth, at every turn, and, just the Republican Party was in shambles. And none of the young kids that I met at Brandeis were excited about Trump. And they actually, none of them were particularly excited about the Republican Party. And almost everyone used the term conservatarian as their political identity, which I just thought was an interesting point because, here's something that we think is so binary. Here is a stat that's being framed as a binary, liberal, conservative. Those are the two identities that a professor can have, and now all these, students who are part of this Republican club are actually calling themselves conservatarians. So I rolled with it, and I still didn't really know what I was doing at Brandeis, but I just kept going back every week to the meetings that these students were having. And kind of got to know them a little bit. They became more comfortable having me in the room, so their, conversations could flourish a little bit more organically, and I feel like they maybe let their guard down a little bit. So, I would call them, I would email them, and then, we finally got to the point of like, hey, what is it actually like being a conservative at Brandeis? So here is, conservative students, are they offended, are they annoyed? And this is from Mark Gimmelstein, who was the president of the Republican club at Brandeis that I was interviewing. My intro to microeconomics course, I won't name the professor, but he literally yelled that he hated Republicans in class. While all my classmates were laughing along, I wasn't laughing. It was kind of insulting, and it made it harder to have a productive conversation. Now, if I'm being totally honest, I never really thought about how this would be affecting students until Mark said this, and I kind of felt bad, and I said, yeah, that's not great. I mean, it's easy to make kind of Republican jokes if you're in a predominantly liberal setting, but you don't know who's you don't know the political identity of all your students, and for someone like Mark, he clearly felt aggrieved or annoyed, and he said it's not something I'm really gonna like fight with my professor about in class. I'm not gonna. It's just easier to keep your head down, do the work, and move on. This is another student, Mike Musto is his name. He was also a brand. And he's, this is a pretty long blurb, but he essentially shared this anecdote about, there was a conservative by the name of Phyllis Schlafly who passed away, and one of his professors, said there's a special place in hell for her, people like her. A month later, when Tom Hayden, co-author of the Port Huron Statement and founder of the Student Democratic Society, died, the same professor gave this really touching eulogy and talked about how important Hayden's contributions were to the left. And Musto said he wasn't a fan of Phyllis Schlafly, but the average student who's just trying to study gets the impression of, oh man, those evil right-wingers, he said. And again, he said the same exact thing that Mark Gimmelstein said. It's just, I keep quiet. It's not worth raising your hand and debating with the professor. Plus, they both made the point of if you do that, then every other classmate knows that you're that, you're the conservative, you're that guy in the eyes of, a lot of their classmates. And, that wasn't something that, they were probably okay taking it on, but it wasn't something that they really wanted to have, be their identity. So being a reporter, I gathered all these anecdotes, and I, sat and talked with these kids, did tons of interviews. And then I was, really happy that the president of Brandeis took the time for an interview and, sat down and talked with me. And I said, hey, you know, I just want you to know, you know, I'm not trying to be a sneaky journalist or anything. I've been going to your, you know, the conservative club meetings, and here are some of the anecdotes I've heard. And I told them what Mike Musto said, and I told them what the other students said. And he said, I would think that Brandeis students, he was also president of Middlebury previously, Middlebury students, smart students, would have the mettle, the ability to question this or push back a little. And I was really glad that this is, you know, how the president of Brandeis responded. Because one thing that I kept hearing throughout all, you know, as a reporter, I'm always talking to my wife or to my, you know, really close friends about what I'm working on. And I would say, hey man, you know, listen, you know, one of the students at Brandeis said that, you know, their professor yelled at that he hates Republicans. Another one, you know, had this Phyllis Schlafly. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term snowflake. It's a pretty popular term right now, kind of on the digital right, where, you know, if you're a student who, you know, wants a trigger warning or, you know, feels like you need a safe space, then, you know, it's kind of in vogue to call those students, you know, snowflakes. They're too sensitive. And it's this kind of verb on the right, or this adjective that the right throws around a lot, especially kind of in the digital world and on Twitter and stuff. And, you know, every person that I was talking to about my reporting who, you know, kind of my friends that I have as like a sounding board, they all identify as liberals, and they're all, you know, very different degrees of steps to the left. They all kept saying, hey, these conservative students sound like snowflakes. You know, they're, you know, why aren't they just, you know, toughening up? And if they're, you know, feel like they're being aggrieved, they should just stand up and, you know, fight back with their professors, because they're always, you know, the right's always criticizing the left for, you know, safe spaces and trigger warnings, and it seems like that's what every one of the students that you're interviewing is calling for. So it was really, you know, I thought it was like, it was pretty interesting and telling that the president of Brandeis, you know, took this line, and I'm really happy that this was, you know, his response to, you know, he wants Brandeis, you know, it is a top 35 school, and he wants it to be a forum for debate, and he didn't want to shy away from the issues that could be, you know, deemed offensive to the left or right. He wants his students to stand up and, you know, make the argument for what they believe in. So I thought that was a pretty encouraging bit of, you know, information coming out of Brandeis, and, you know, I started working on the piece. So again, you know, Brandeis wasn't the only school that I was focused on in my reporting. I also went to Boston University, which a few nights before the election held a student debate in which Nick Fuentes was arguing on behalf of Donald Trump, and another student who was, I believe, the student body president, was arguing on behalf of Hillary Clinton. Nick Fuentes he was a young freshman at Boston University, who Boston University made a series of videos of how are you voting this election, showcasing different students. Nick Fuentes, a big Trump supporter, in that video said multiculturalism is a cancer. And he took, you know, a lot of the talking points that were coming out of the alt-right, multiculturalism is a cancer being the most salient, and kind of just was, you know, repeating them, and he went kind of viral. He had this, you know, kind of bizarre following after this video came out. And I went to this debate in which he, you know, this was 3 or 4 nights before the election, and he was debating, you know, the student body president. And the student body president, who was supposed to be, you know, a pro-Hillary person, or, you know, arguing for Hillary. He was a young man from Ohio, I believe, who said he was not voting for Hillary Clinton because he couldn't, you know, he was from a swing state. He was the man who was supposed to be, you know, arguing for Hillary Clinton, and he said, I'm not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. She's, you know, stole the election from Bernie. And in my head, that should have been like, wow, Donald Trump's probably going to win this thing, when the person, you know, it was a very, like, big red flag, and I kind of just chalked it up to college kids being college kids. But, you know, so I bring up Nick Fuentes to illustrate, like, the kids at Brandeis that I was interviewing and really focused on in my article were very nuanced and they were very thoughtful. That is not to say that there was not, you know, elements of the alt-right creeping up on campus. And I think, you know, Nick Fuentes just railing against immigration and multiculturalism, was an illustration of like, all right, we should be careful because there is a huge spectrum of what it means to be conservative right now. And these, kids are, finding their ways to different, some of them are conservatarians and some of them are, fully taking the Trump line of conservatism and embracing it. So I sat down to start writing this piece on like November 6th. And in my head, I was like, well, Clinton's probably going to win, and this is going to be a really good piece because it'll be now 12, we're looking at 12 years of, progressive presidents, and it'll be, really interesting to look at how, the conservative professors and students are being marginalized in that. And then, of course, everything, kind of went upended. Trump won. And mobs of tearful, angry students protesting Trump victory swarmed college campuses. And I started thinking like, oh man, this story is toast. Like, we don't have a story anymore. I got really nervous. And I continued to be really nervous. And then something called the Professor Watch List came out on November 22nd. It was a few, maybe weeks after the election. And this was a watch list created by a conservative think tank, Turning Point USA, that was just listing, professors who either had identified as liberal or who had been accused of, having a liberal bias. And this actually gave me a lot of anxiety because I was like, this does not seem like, a watch list. That is very aggressive. And now I'm, I felt like I was pouring salt in the wounds, kind of. Like it was, Trump had won. A lot of progressive people were, everything just seemed in flux. The country was, everyone kind of seemed to be losing their minds. Now there was a professor watch list coming out, and then I'm writing a piece called How Liberals Are Ruining College, and I'm not even sure I agree with that sentiment. So, I really started having a bit of angst around this story. And then I reminded myself that actually the story here comes back to that ratio. This is a story about a 20, whether Trump's in office, whether there's a liberal watch list, none of that matters. What matters is that there is this, 28-to-1 ratio. I've done my reporting. I've talked with conservative students who feel, like they're being marginalized on campus or they can't, express their views on campus. And then, so I sat down and, I started thinking, and I kind of made the, I don't know, maybe this is true, maybe it's not, but I convinced myself, like, actually, in the wake of the Trump presidency, when I was thinking about those students at Brandeis, none of them were big Trump supporters. None of them, I think, were Trump supporters at all. And now it probably is even harder to be a conservative on campus because you're just kind of, if you're a conservative, then you must be a Trump supporter. So that, it seemed like it would just, everything was being amplified. The tensions were higher than ever. So I sat down, wrote the article. I went through a very lengthy editing process. We went through 4 or 5 drafts. Came out, in January 2016. No, I'm sorry, January 2017. It came out, I got all those emails. People loved it, people hated it, people told me I was a genius, people told me I was a moron. And then I did my thing. By the time this story was coming out, I was already writing a feature story on the CEO of LL Bean. So, I had moved on. But, since the story, we've had a conservative, Charles Murray, physically confronted at Middlebury on campus, which is a pretty high-profile national happening. Brandeis, I just heard on the radio, is canceling the staging of a play because of students' concerns over the playwrights, how he depicted certain characters. White nationalists and neo-Nazis have marched on the University of Virginia, leading to deadly clash. These are not equivalent. I don't want to be creating false equivalencies. This is just a smattering of, things that have happened in 2017, which, doesn't make me feel particularly optimistic when it comes to thinking about, like, are we going to have are we going to build bridges on campus? Is there a way to, foster better dialogue between conservatives and liberals? Is the 28-to-1 ratio, should we be trying to remedy this? It just seems like the past year, tensions are getting higher and higher. there is a inclination on the right, I think, to, you're seeing, or at least I'm seeing, some of the, Breitbart and right-wing sites really seizing on the tension on college campuses and turning it into, this kind of media flashpoint and just gutting it of all nuance and just, making it liberals are taking over college and, and then you're seeing violent incidents. So coming back to that 28-to-1, is this a problem that needs solving? What would a solution look like? I don't know, is this something, and this is something I really would like to hear from, professors and administrators. Do you think this is a problem that needs to be addressed, or is this something that works itself out organically over time? One suggestion that a person offered was, we should have a visiting professor system where, maybe professors from conservative departments or conservative schools come up to the Northeast and, do a semester at Middlebury while a liberal professor, somebody that's more progressive goes down to a, Southern school or a Rocky Mountain school, and, would that be a way of kind of addressing this viewpoint disparity among professors? I didn't think anybody would want a kind of affirmative action system for conservative professors, and among the professors I talked to, they said no, conservative and liberal professors alike said that's not a solution to this problem. But the president of Brandeis said a lot of alums and donors and that are on the conservative side think that's a great idea, and that's how we need to address this. Then there's this last. Jonathan Haidt, who's a New York University social science or social psychologist, he is a kind of thought leader on viewpoint diversity on campuses, and he says, "I believe that the conflict between truth and social justice is likely to become unmanageable. Universities will have to choose and be explicit about their choice so that potential students and faculty recruits can make an informed choice. Universities that try to honor both will face increasing incoherence and internal conflict." So he essentially sees, a future where there are universities that are committed to social justice and universities that are committed to academic pursuits and, not, social justice. So that is my spiel. I am happy, I have plenty of questions if there's professors in this room, but I'm also happy to field questions. I'm happy to talk about my reporting or, anything that, I'm open to any reasonable questions.
Hi, teach psychology here. I appreciated your article. I actually bought it at Whole Foods.
Did you buy it because of the cover?
Oh yeah, I was like, I didn't know. I've also had conversations with students from a range of political perspectives about how the content in my class jives with their political beliefs or is very opposed to it. And but anyway, so I'm particularly interested in this. But I was curious, when you talked to faculty, how clear they were in their identification, their political identification. Because like right now, I don't identify as liberal or conservative. I identify as disgusted. So I don't know if disgusted is enough.
I don't think there's a little checkbox.
Right, but if people were. If it was easy for folks to identify one way or the other, or if you had to kind of suss it out of them, just curious.
Yeah, so that was almost always like one of the first questions I asked was, how do you identify politically? And then it got into that binary thing, and people said, well, there's on social issues I'm very progressive, on economic issues I can be a little bit more conservative. I don't think, no one comes to mind as being like, oh, I'm a Democrat, and you can check the box left. And I kind of mentioned this in the article, and this is one of the big criticisms of Sam Abrams' research and the whole notion of putting a ratio together like this. Political identities are social constructs that are constantly changing. one day I might be very liberal, one day I might be not so liberal, one day I might be super conservative. It all depends on what's in the news that day, how the stock market's doing, what I think of the man or woman in, office. So, yeah, to your point, no, I can't remember anyone just saying, yeah, oh yeah, I identify purely as a, liberal. I think everyone, especially when you're dealing with, very heady academics in fields of political science or sociology or social psychology, they think deeply about these issues too, and they think deeply about social constructs. And I don't think anyone fit neatly into that package. Does that answer your question?
I've been trying to take notes. I'm Marcia Merck, and I'm also in the psychology, social sciences program. So I was confused about a couple of things. I had some, hopefully this will all come together. But first of all, I think anyone who says I hate Republicans or I hate Democrats is totally inappropriate to do that in the classroom. So that's not, I don't think that's as much about liberal or conservative professors. I just think it's inappropriate.
Sure.
The other thing is I was a little concerned about the Brandeis president, even though I love a lot about Brandeis. And that's because to say that smart kids should be able to do this is a problem on so many levels. One is that there's a power differential, and smart kids may keep their mouths shut because of that. The other is calling them smart kids and therefore they should do that. He was judging smarts by which college they went to. There's a lot of other ways of seeing that, so I had some concerns about that. I also wasn't sure, I'm still back to your question about what's a conservative and what's a liberal, because on the one hand, I have colleagues with very different economic positions than I would have, and I love the conversations with them. There's also the social issues, and when we say that it's a 28-to-1, it's a really big gap between conservatives and liberals, but I would argue that there's also a gap that's at least that big based on race, probably based on class, maybe based on gender identity. So I'm just wondering where those lines get drawn.
So I am not I don't know, the 28-to-1 comes out of the Institute, I might be botching this name, but it's like the Institute for Higher Education Research, and they do a biannual survey of random professors across the country, and I do believe they probably have socioeconomic information, race information. This is a pretty thorough survey, I'd imagine. So I don't know how the but I would assume you're right. I would imagine there's a big racial divide. I would imagine you'd see similar rifts in socioeconomic. There tends to be a bit of affluence among scholars sometimes. It's the scholarly life is something that was previously probably only accessible to higher earning families. So to get to your point about the president of Brandeis, I never thought about that. I never thought about his use of the word smart in that quote, and it's a really great point you make. He's a man who has spent the better part of his past 30 years at Middlebury and Brandeis, so he's coming from two highly regarded social liberal arts colleges. So yeah, maybe I think his use of the word smart might you could easily take issue with how he kind of phrased that statement. And I'm sorry, I don't recall the third part of the question.
Oh, just what was conservative and what was liberal between social issues, political issues, economic issues.
And this is something that it's so hard to it seems like going back to these are just one day you're something and one day you're not, and maybe even the stock market booms and all of a sudden you're very interested in conservative policy, fiscal policy. But I will say that Paul Krugman of the New York Times has written extensively on Sam Abrams' research, and he makes the argument that the higher education, there's a pretty good amount of research showing that the higher education level that someone's attains, the more liberal they tend to be. And what is the other component of this? That, how the Foxification and now the Trumpification of the Republican Party may have pushed a lot of higher educated people who identified as conservatives over to the left and changed their political identity. And that's something that Krugman argues in the New York Times pretty thoroughly. And it would be, if you're interested in I would point you to Paul Krugman's articles, because it's a very valid point. And I think, when you look at how the definition of conservatism and you can kind of look at like how the Republican Party has changed over the past 20 years, it very well might be the case that you see some brain drain. You see the higher educated, PhD, holders going and identifying more as, a step to the left as opposed to a step to the right.
I was giving a moment to see if my student plants were looking to speak up. They know who they are. There we go. Alex is not a plant.
Even better.
I just have a few comments and questions and statements to make. One, I always like to listen on both sides of the story. I like to always be open to hearing what someone's opinions are. Actually, I fall more to the left, if I had to say, but I'm also a straight, able-bodied male, come from upper middle class, so it's easy for me to be going for one side, but then at the same time, I'm also benefiting from things of society that work for those type of people. I just feel like I actually have a class where I feel like my professor is unbelievably unfair in how liberal she is. And sometimes I just try to argue the other side, even though I don't genuinely believe in it, and she generally doesn't give me a chance, or any of the other students a chance. So that's something where I'm agreeing with you, however I don't agree with everything else. At the same time, there's a lot of students that fall to the conservative side on this campus, and this is an event that gives them the opportunity to speak their part. And I know there's a few people here, and I don't know everybody, so I can't assume which side you fall for, but I wish there were more conservative students that I know that go to the school here and speaking up their part, because this is a chance for them to do so. I think that's where they should come, so I feel like they have their opinions, but they don't want to always put them into action when they have the chance to do so. That could also be my own opinion, but yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, and you're also trying, maybe some of those conservative students don't want to be, quote unquote outed as a conservative for coming here and, standing up and saying, oh, I agree with every point you made in this article or something like that. So it's just, you never know really how these people, how anyone wants their political identity to be shared and revealed, and to what extent.
Hi. I actually never read your article, but
That is
saw
okay.
the cover. But I came here today because I also am someone who is very interested in hearing different opinions and hearing what people say and talk. And I do agree this is a time for a lot of because it's easier for a lot of liberals who do go to a liberal college because you're surrounded by other liberal people, so you always have the chance to talk. But now it's nice to hear other people's opinions and to see how the voice, because there are conservative kids here, and I even though it's yes, I am liberal and I am an activist, and I will admit it because I have no shame. I do feel we do also have to be open to the conservative sides. Yes, I may not agree with everything that a lot of alt-right conservative people will say, but I will say they are entitled to their opinions because they are, as people and as an activist, we have to be able to listen to both sides. That is the job of an activist, is to be open-minded and to be able to assimilate everyone into a culture, which is our American culture. It doesn't have to be divided into groups. And so I am happy that I did come and I listened to what you had to say, even though it was interesting because I thought you were going to be conservative, but you're not. So that was very interesting to see. But I think that also left out a lot of the biases, which was also very nice to hear. And yeah, I don't know, like I expected a lot more conservative kids here, because I was very, like, I just wanted to see what they had to say and like listen to them. Like, I'm not here to beat people up, like I'm not one of those activists, I'm just here to listen, like that's all I'm here to do.
But I think, you kind of hit on one of the, and in the article I talk toward the end, just, I think it's really important, and we're kind of at a very important juncture, that we cannot let academic spaces devolve into hyper-partisan zones. This is one of the few places left where, you can kind of transcend all the bickering, turn off, the 24-hour news cycle and think and listen and learn. And it shouldn't be, that you're learning from a conservative or that you're learning from, a liberal. It should just be that you're, learning and growing intellectually. And it seems that every day that's at greater risk. The more that this is politicized, the less kind of the sanctuary of the college campus seems to be more, less of a sanctuary.
I'm just curious if you're interested in another article which might be looking outside of New England and going back to your data that showed that there's kind of a low percentage, which means it's kind of an average of liberal versus conservative, and where are there areas in the country that are more conservative than liberal, and showing that perhaps even at those institutions, liberal students are the ones that feel uncomfortable or intimidated, and to then be able to make the argument that both sides and institutions across the country need to think about this more, and not just focus on one particular profile.
Yeah, no, it's a really valid point too. And being Boston Magazine, we were definitely focused on New England, and just in terms of like. When I heard this and I started looking, I expected that the ratio, we would see the most, maybe skew conservative in the South. It was the Rocky Mountain states that had, and that surprised me, and I don't know why that surprised me, and I don't necessarily know why it is, but just an interesting tidbit.
I just want to say, I thought it was a really good point you made about the more conservative viewed students maybe not wanting to kind of out themselves, because I know from experience, I am a conservative, and I have a class, not going to name any specifics or anything, but where I don't necessarily speak out on my view as much as I should, because the teacher has made it very clear that she's very liberal and she's against everything that is conservative, everything we stand for, and it's just. Sometimes it's intimidating to kind of come out and say, what you really believe, because in fear of being, thought differently of or hated on, or in some, retrospects, grading. We're in fear that if we come out and speak against them, that it's going to reflect on our grading and just how we're treated as, students here and peers.
And this was something that, I heard from almost every conservative student I talked to. And when you're a college student, grades are pretty much, the gold standard. It's why, you need to do well. And almost every conservative student said, I don't want this to affect my grades. And, I have one unnamed source whose name was changed. He was a young freshman, and he was, really, really worried about being quoted in an article and having it affect his grades at the end of the semester.
Pretty bad. I don't need a microphone. That's all right.
There's a couple of things I want to say about this. This comes up in my class all the time. I teach a very hot class of issues, and right, Connor? Let's say that. And it comes up quite a bit. And there's a couple things that I've noticed over the years, because I'm kind of on the older side, and that is that I feel that what's happened now, I'm not sure there's any more conservatives or any more liberals than there used to be when I went to college many years ago. But what's very different is that everybody is very worried about how everybody else feels, so no one feels safe anymore. And so it's not so much how you feel, it's that one of the things I want to say about that is that I recognize that everyone is biased. And I think that you need to be very comfortable about saying in the classroom that everyone is biased. And I want you to argue passionately for your biased side. And just because I'm biased doesn't mean it's going to affect your grade. And somehow, all of a sudden, there's no question that the students are frightened that it is going to, I've heard it before. But I don't think that used to be true, but now very much is true. People think they're going to have severe consequences for what they believe, no matter what the side is and where they are. And I would like to put my finger on why that is. I mean, what I'm thinking about is how even people want to, this whole thing that Bill Maher talks about all the time, where the comedians, right, are going to, and they might protest him because he speaks about Muslims, and that's not politically correct at the college campuses. So it seems like reasonable minds can't differ anymore. And that's what I think is the base problem, not what side you're on, and I don't know how to make that better, but that, because you should be able, no matter how outrageous your idea is, to say it.
So as a professor, do you feel like you're walking on eggshells more often around your class than 10 years ago?
I think most professors do, but because I'm not good at walking on eggshells, I don't. So you can, is that a true statement?
Yeah, I would kind of like to talk about it afterwards. So we're in a senior capstone class, and it's we're in the legal studies department, so it's very politically based, and we kind of run a forum for it for the classroom setting. So there is a lot of like controversy where certain students who identify as conservative or whatnot kind of, it's almost like we're like you sit at a certain end of the table, and then here's the question, and then everybody speaks, and they're like, oh, what do you guys say? And I thought that was kind of interesting, even to hear from several other students who were kind of touched upon how the conservative base or population of the students aren't here right now. And I thought that it was a very great point that you said, hey, maybe you don't want to be outed as being the conservative, and that is a very valid point. And I've spoke with Jesse about that prior to coming to this event. And I don't think that that's the main point, because I think some people thought that maybe like conservative students would be coming in here and they'd be like hipping and hurrahing, like, yeah, we have a conservative person coming in here and speaking, and I don't really think that that was like what the outcome was going to be expected of. I think that this whole presentation was presented very well, just on talking about how you were unbiased about it. And I don't think that it should be like a Democrat versus Republican thing, which the title kind of...
Well, that's my question is, all right, so there's been, a few people pointing out that there's, there's conservative students here, but they're not here in this room. Do you think that if, I believe this was billed as, a talk about the value of viewpoint diversity on campus, do you think if this was billed as, a talk about how liberals are ruining college, that the conservative students would have turned out today?
That's a very interesting question, and I think that to some extent maybe it would have, because I knew about this because I'm writing for the paper and I talked with Jesse about it, so I kind of had a background into it, whereas other people, it wasn't kind of presented that way, because I know we had a discussion after the election about people who were affected by the Trump election or whatever, and I know that there was a lot of outlash from like conservative students who attended that or something like that. And again, it's supposed to be the academic setting where you get to say your opinion, but it is kind of scary for you to be like the 4 or 5 kids who show up to a room full of 40 or 50 people, especially your academic professors and whatnot, and for them to like look at you like oh, that's that so-and-so kid, one of 4 people who wore the Make America Great Again hat and said this or that at the forum. It kind of puts a target on you, especially with the grading thing. I personally don't believe, because I know my professor, but from the discussions that we have in class, I don't feel that like ethically that there is any sort of bias that would interpret my grade at any point. But I can understand that some students do feel that way, and I think that's a huge issue, especially when you talk about these Brandeis students who are like, hey, I don't want to say what I want to say because my grade's on the line. Yeah. And I don't think somebody, people can't understand that because they're not in those shoes. So it's kind of a difficult concept. However, to finish this off, I do have a question with the affirmative action. Both sides said that they think, oh, that's not a solution to the problem, and I want to know why, because if it's okay to use affirmative action for the students who are being accepted into these universities and whatnot, then how is it not okay to do the same thing for the faculty? Like, it should work from the top down.
So I might botch this a little bit, but I do believe that, you know, traditional conservative viewpoint is not for affirmative action. You know, they tend, you know, a lot of conservatives tend to be against affirmative action. So therefore, saying, hey, you know, to fix this problem, let's do something that you're against, doesn't work for them. And then on the other side of the political spectrum, it was like, no, you know, we don't need to be giving, you know, changing hiring and hiring policy preferences around political viewpoints. So that was kind of, you know, the conservatives don't like affirmative action and didn't want to benefit from it, you know, in this context. And, you know, the progressive professors that I've chatted with just did not think it was a reasonable solution to this problem.